Well, hello, my lovely lilies. Tonight, I bring you 8 creepypasta stories among the most terrifying the internet has to offer. And with the creepypasta icons like Slender Man, Candle Cove, or Robert the Doll, you know these ones will be truly terrifying. The internet swoons over these tales. From urban legends to campfire stories, these short horror stories will satisfy your need for a dose of scary. But be careful, they're bound to send you cowering beneath your sheets. Without further ado, close the blinds, dim those lights, cuddle under your favorite blanket, and let's begin. The rainy season began in early summer, and June had been no exception. It did not surprise the man when he discovered rainwater dripping from his dining room ceiling. Shrugging it off, he placed a tall pot beneath the leak and expected it to stop on its own. However, it continued to rain, and before he knew it, the pot would threaten to overflow. He had to dump the water out first thing in the morning, and straight after he returned home from work. Eventually, he began to notice water damage at the source of the leak. The white ceiling had discolored, turning a dull shade of brown. He checked the weather and realized that it would continue to rain sporadically over the next 10 days. The man was worried about the ceiling mildewing and becoming an expensive repair, so he called a local handyman. Unfortunately, the man could not sign to have the repairs done. Only his landlord could. It was a frustrating policy. The man called his landlord, but could not reach him. He left him a few voicemails, detailing how the damage was becoming progressively worse. The man was clueless as to why his landlord would not return his calls. They usually kept in touch, speaking at least twice a month. Finally, he reasoned that he would not be held accountable for any damages sustained. One night, the man was startled awake by a massive thump. He quickly turned on his bedside lamp, and just vaguely he could see an overturned table and a large shape laying across it. He sprinted out of his apartment and called the police, gagging at the smell. The poor man, he sat in the police station with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a coffee mug resting in his hands. He did know one thing. There had been a dead body in his ceiling, and the water had saturated it so badly that it caved under the weight. So far, the body was unidentifiable due to the rainwater and was being sent for an autopsy. While the man waited, he called his landlord and finally reached him, panicking as he explained the situation. His landlord was just as alarmed, and the man pleaded for him to come to the station while he made his statement. The man paused as a detective crossed over to him, and he lowered his phone, wondering if the body had been identified. His blood ran immediately cold, and he shook his head with terror. The body belonged to Richard Thomas, his landlord, and he had died over a year ago. That is not what disturbed him the most. If his landlord was dead, then who was pretending to be him? I sat on the bus on the way to school, listening to my music and paying little to no attention to the other students. At one of the stops, my mind snapped back to reality. I looked towards a small house. Tommy's house, I thought. A hand slipped through the drapes of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. He's sick, I thought, paying no large amount of attention to the situation. The day flew by. I watched the local news channel after school, and what I heard paralyzed me. Tommy's entire family was murdered that day by an unknown suspect. After hearing this news, I moved back up to my room and quietly fell asleep. The next day, I sat on the bus. We drove past Tommy's house, and the bus driver, unaware of Tommy's family's fate, stopped at his home. As I was about to get up and explain to her what had happened, something caught my eye. A pale hand slipped through the drapes of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. I sat on the bus, terrified. My grandmother grew up in the slums of the Prohibition era in Chicago. Her family lived in a small house near the harbor, and one of her earliest memories was of a particular hot summer when, seeking respite from the heat, she and her sister discovered a seldom-used section of boardwalk near an abandoned warehouse. Every night for several weeks, the two girls would make their way down to the docks and sit together on the edge of the pier as the sun went down. My grandmother vividly, and for a time fondly, recalled the feel of the seaweed between her toes as she and her sister dangled their feet into the murky water. It wasn't until years later that she returned to the pier and found that the warehouses had been demolished. Curious, she made an inquiry with the Department of Planning and Development. Apparently, the warehouse had been owned for a time by the mob, who was using it as a base of operation for a local prostitution racket. It had only been uncovered when an associate began disposing of rival hookers by fitting them with concrete shoes and dumping them into the harbor. Investigating officers had recovered nearly 24 bodies from the waters of a secluded pier nearby. How had the bodies been discovered? A passing fisherman spotted some of the victims' hair floating near the surface of the water, like seaweed. It all started on the 14th night of March, the night of my parents' 20th wedding anniversary. It was a wonderful sunny day, if memory serves. Surprisingly warm for before the beginning of spring. The beautiful weather was perfect for the atmosphere of the day. Being married for 20 years is obviously a monumentous occasion, so my parents had booked a table at our favorite Italian restaurant. Of course, this was a formal occasion, so I had my best dress on. It was 5:33 p.m., and I was just straightening my hair when my phone went off. I'd received a message. That's strange, I thought. That never happens. I checked the message. It was my mom. It was quite a jumble of numbers and letters, but through the vocabulary stew, I could make out one legible phrase. Please help me. It should go without saying that this worried me greatly, so I immediately replied, "Are you okay?" Just as instantly, I got another text message which read, "Oops, pocket text." I sighed with all the relief I had and continued to prepare myself. A few minutes later, I received yet another message, this time from my dad. It was a massive mixture of letters and numbers, with the phrase "help me" concealed within. Creepy though it was, my dad always was a joker, so I presumed he was just joking around, until I was sent another text saying, "Oops, pocket text." Now this sparked panic, pure, unmistakable panic. Exactly half a minute passed when I received the exact same two messages from my sister. This could not be coincidental. It just couldn't. In a state of sheer anxiety, I started to run to the restaurant. I made it about a quarter of the way before I was stopped by a police officer. "Main road's closed," he said. huge car crash. This was the exact moment I realized just what had happened. I demanded to see the wreckage, a request which I was surprised was allowed. When I got there, it wasn't the remains of the car that caught my eye, or the flames billowing from the destroyed vehicle. No, I was horrified to see the lifeless corpses of my mother, father, and sister. I asked for the estimated time of their deaths. All 3 of them were killed instantly by the collision at 5:32 p.m., a full minute before the very first text. Growing up poor in the Deep South meant sharing a lot with my little brother, Ollie. Most often, we'd pass toys, clothes, and even skin conditions between us. Up until he was 6, we even shared a bed. Neither of us was happy about that. It was my 10th birthday when that changed. I got one present that year, and it was a bed of my own. Ollie was jealous right away, and I could understand why. He had to keep that half-broken down frame with a worn-out mattress. The one I'd gotten wasn't much better, but not being broken and worn was enough. Sleeping apart was a great feeling. It was freedom. No longer would I have to suffer the sudden and inexplicable kicks to the stomach. No longer would I wake up with Ollie's foot pressed into my neck like he had stepped on Dracula the night before. At least, that's what I thought. Right away, right after I got the new bed, the shrieking started. At first I thought Ollie woke up in the middle of the night and screamed because he had gotten scared. Then the sound echoed through the tiny room again, and I knew it wasn't a normal cry. The room was always black as pitch. After sunset, the one window we had was pressed against a long leaf pine, and even the biggest, brightest moon casted no light inside. The shriek just about drove me crazy. Every night, probably at the same exact time, these sharp yelps would knock me right out of my dreams. It wasn't my mom or dad yelling either. I knew what that sounded like. Believe me. Most worrying of all was the fact I could never tell where it was coming from. It seemed completely random. One night, it would come from somewhere near the closet. The next, it'd shoot out from a corner of the ceiling. Any hope I had of having my own space would get dashed every time as Ollie would silently slip into the bed with me, shaking like crazy. He'd clasp onto me and wouldn't let go until it was almost daybreak. Most times, I'd take his hand and tell him everything was going to be okay, that it'd be over by morning, but I was never really sure. Over time, the shrieks started changing. At first, it was only by small degrees, but eventually it took on the primal hooting sound of a primate calling out its fierce warning. I had to clasp the pillows to my ears just to keep from going deaf. Mom and Dad never believed me or Ollie. Basically because the thing, whatever it was, refused to make a peep when they were in the room. Apparently, they couldn't even hear it through the walls, even though it was darn sure loud enough. The shriek just got worse and worse until I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. Me and Ollie were doing really bad in school, and we just had no energy at all. I could sleep more deeply with my head propped up and eyes open in the middle of class than in my own room at night. Then, thankfully, we moved out of the house nearly a year later. I had contemplated all sorts of things, even a child's clumsy concept of suicide, to get away from the horrific nightly noise. There was no problem at the next house. It was a nice, white cookie-cutter home on a dead-end street, and I welcomed the normalcy. Once more, when we moved in there was bunk beds waiting for me and Ollie. No more broken beds, no more second bed I ended up having to share anyway. The only problem was deciding who would get the top bunk. I told Ollie I deserved it. After all, I had gotten a new bed way back, and he ruined it by climbing in every night. What? He shook his head. I never did that. I had always wondered why the noise stopped the second I was sharing my bed. Now, I have the answer. Alright, my lovely lilies, thank you so much for watching the new video. If you can, hit that subscribe and like button, comment below and tell me your thoughts. Also, don't forget to tap the little notification bell so you're always in the know on this channel. As well, guys, you can always find me on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and always you can hit me up in my emails. Feel free to send me your stories, whether they're fiction or totally true. I'm always up for some great stories. And oh, by the way, until next time, sweet dreams.